When apex predators lose fear and hunger takes over, even steel, engines, and human crowds offer no protection. These attacks strike without warning, leaving destruction in their wake. From a polar bear tearing into a snowcat in the Arctic to backpackers fighting for their lives in Colorado, no wilderness is truly safe. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters that shocked the world. On November 4, 2025, a research team of 6 departed from a temporary field station along the Beaufort Sea coast in Alaska's North Slope region. The area had become increasingly important for climate researchers monitoring the rapid decline of Arctic sea ice, which had been disappearing at alarming rates over the previous decade. The coastline itself was a desolate expanse of white, broken only by jagged pressure ridges and the occasional dark patch of exposed tundra. Temperatures hovered around -20 degrees Celsius, and weather forecasts warned of an incoming storm system that could bring whiteout conditions within hours. The team traveled in a Snowcat, a tracked vehicle designed for polar research. Driver Caleb Rourke sat at the controls, his weathered hands guiding the machine across the ice with practiced ease. Beside him in the cramped cabin sat Dr. Lena Havel, a biologist studying the impact of warming waters on Arctic marine ecosystems. Behind them, mechanic Rita Solis checked the equipment readings, while intern Mason Doyle organized the data tablets. Technician Jeremiah Pike monitored communication equipment, and weather analyst Sarah Klein studied radar patterns on a small screen, her expression growing increasingly concerned. Their mission was straightforward: collect ice core samples from 3 predetermined locations and return before the storm arrived. The first 2 sites had gone smoothly, but as they approached the 3rd location, visibility began deteriorating rapidly. Within minutes, the world outside transformed into an impenetrable wall of swirling white. Caleb brought the Snowcat to a halt, explaining that continuing would be too dangerous until the squall passed. Rita noticed the navigation system flickering and announced she would need to check the rear maintenance panel. She bundled herself in additional layers and stepped through the small rear hatch, her safety line secured to an interior rail. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet as she examined the panel, her fingers fumbling with frozen latches. After several minutes of work, she returned inside, stamping snow from her boots and declaring the problem fixed. What she failed to notice was that the rear maintenance hatch had not fully locked into place. The latch mechanism, weakened by repeated freeze-thaw cycles, had only partially caught. The team settled in to wait out the weather. Mason complained about the delay affecting their schedule. Jeremiah attempted to maintain radio contact with the base station, but received only static. Dr. Havel reviewed the sample data, while Sarah continued to monitor the storm's progression. They estimated that another hour would pass before visibility improved enough to continue safely. Unknown to them, a male polar bear had been tracking their vehicle for nearly 30 minutes. The animal was gaunt, its ribs visible beneath matted fur. Sea ice that would normally extend far from shore had retreated dramatically, forcing bears to search for food along the coastline rather than hunting seals from ice platforms. This particular bear had gone weeks without a substantial meal, and the scent of humans and equipment had drawn it closer with each passing minute. The bear circled the stationary Snowcat, its massive paws silent on the snow despite weighing over 600 kilograms. It sniffed at the exhaust port, pawed at the treads, and eventually discovered the rear maintenance hatch. The improperly secured latch gave way under the animal's weight. Chaos erupted immediately. Rita, who had been closest to the rear, screamed as the hatch burst inward, and the bear's head appeared in the opening. The animal's shoulders barely fit through the gap, but it lunged forward with terrifying determination. Jeremiah tried to push past the others toward the front exit, but the cramped space made movement nearly impossible. Dr. Havel grabbed an equipment case to use as a shield, while Caleb fumbled for the emergency flare gun stored near the driver's seat. Mason activated the radio, his voice cracking as he transmitted desperate pleas for help. The transmission captured the sounds of metal tearing, screaming, and the bear's heavy breathing. Rita was pulled backward despite her attempts to grip the equipment racks. Jeremiah tried to reach the front hatch but stumbled over the overturned gear. Dr. Havel struck the bear with a metal clipboard, but the animal barely registered the impacts. Sarah, positioned nearest the side emergency hatch, made a split-second decision. While the others were focused on the bear entering from the rear, she unlatched the side exit and threw herself into the storm. The wind immediately disoriented her, but she knew the general direction of a supply cache located approximately 400 meters away. She ran mindlessly through the whiteout, falling twice on uneven ice, driven by pure adrenaline and the sounds of horror behind her. Inside the Snowcat, the attack continued with brutal efficiency. The confined space that had seemed protective now became a trap. Caleb managed to fire the flare gun, but in the chaos it struck the ceiling and ricocheted harmlessly. The bear's weight crushed equipment and bent metal framing as it forced itself further inside. Sarah reached the supply cache after what felt like an eternity, but was likely less than 10 minutes. Her hands shook violently as she activated the satellite emergency beacon and huddled inside the small insulated shelter. She could hear nothing over the howling wind, but waited in frozen terror. Rescue teams received the beacon signal and launched within 20 minutes, but the storm delayed their arrival. Nearly 3 hours passed before helicopters could reach the location. What they discovered would haunt the rescuers for years to come. The Snowcat's rear section had been torn apart from the inside. Equipment was scattered and destroyed. Blood stained the interior walls and floor. Caleb Rourke, Dr. Lena Havel, Rita Solis, Mason Doyle, and Jeremiah Pike were all found dead inside the vehicle. The polar bear had fled, leaving enormous tracks leading back toward the coast. Sarah Klein was located at the supply cache, suffering from severe frostbite and shock, but alive. She remained the only witness to what had occurred during those terrifying minutes inside the Snowcat, and her testimony would prompt immediate changes to Arctic research protocols regarding vehicle security and emergency procedures in polar bear territory. On June 12, 2024, friends Jenna Crow and Shiloh Reeve launched their kayaks into a quiet estuary on Kodiak Island, Alaska. The location they had chosen was a sheltered inlet, approximately 8 miles south of Kodiak City, known locally for its abundant shorebird populations and scenic mudflats that emerged during low tide. Kodiak Island had long been recognized as one of the premier locations for wildlife photography in Alaska. However, it was also home to one of the densest populations of brown bears in the world. The bears, a subspecies that could weigh over 700 kilograms, were generally tolerant of human presence but remained unpredictable, especially when cubs were involved. The morning had dawned clear and calm, with barely a ripple disturbing the water's surface. Jenna, an amateur photographer with several years of kayaking experience, had suggested the early departure to catch the golden light of sunrise reflecting off the exposed mudflats. Shiloh, newer to both kayaking and photography, had agreed enthusiastically. They had carefully checked the tide charts, noting that low tide would occur around 7 a.m., giving them a 2-hour window before the water began rising again. They paddled quietly through the estuary, their kayaks gliding smoothly over the glassy water. The exposed mudflats stretched before them, dotted with feeding plovers and sandpipers. Jenna pointed out various species while Shiloh adjusted her camera settings. Neither woman noticed the brown bear sow feeding among the clams approximately 100 meters ahead, partially obscured by a small rise in the terrain. Her 2 cubs, each roughly 6 months old, played nearby, occasionally digging in the mud themselves. The kayakers drifted closer, focused entirely on photographing a group of dunlins that had landed near the water's edge. One of the cubs, curious about the strange floating objects approaching, splashed toward them through the shallow water. The movement caught Shiloh's attention first, and she gasped, immediately recognizing what she was seeing. Before either woman could react appropriately, the mother bear charged. The sow moved with shocking speed for an animal of her size, water spraying around her as she lunged forward. She rose on her hind legs, chest deep in the estuary, and slammed both front paws down onto Jenna's kayak. The impact flipped the vessel instantly, throwing Jenna into the cold water. Her camera, still attached to its neck strap, dragged at her as she surfaced, disoriented and gasping. Shiloh paddled frantically toward the nearest mudflat, her kayak scraping bottom as she tried to beach it. She stumbled out onto the exposed flat, immediately sinking to her knees in the thick mud. She screamed and waved her paddle overhead, hoping to redirect the bear's attention or at least appear threatening. The sow, however, had focused entirely on Jenna and the overturned kayak. Jenna tried to swim toward the mudflat where Shiloh stood, but the bear swatted at the kayak again, its claws tearing through the fiberglass hull like paper. Chunks of the bright yellow vessel floated away on the current. Jenna changed direction, swimming instead toward a cluster of rocks that jutted from the water about 20 meters to her left. The sow followed briefly, then paused to check on her cubs. Shiloh pulled herself free from the sucking mud and scrambled onto the rocks, reaching down to help Jenna climb up. Both women were shaking violently, their clothing soaked and already sapping their body heat despite the relatively mild morning temperature. The rock outcrop was barely 2 meters across and rose less than a meter above the current water level. Shiloh noticed with growing alarm that the tide line on the rocks indicated they would be submerged within the hour. The sow stood in the shallow water, watching them. Her cubs had retreated to the shoreline, calling to her with high-pitched bleats. She huffed loudly, shaking water from her fur, then moved toward the kayaker's refuge. Shiloh raised her paddle defensively while Jenna searched desperately for anything that might serve as a deterrent. The bear circled the rocks, occasionally standing upright to peer at them, but did not attempt to climb up. For nearly 50 minutes, the standoff continued. The water gradually rose around their small island, first covering their feet, then reaching their ankles. The cold became increasingly dangerous. Jenna had lost sensation in her fingers, and Shiloh's lips had turned blue. The bear remained nearby, sometimes appearing to lose interest, but never wandering far enough for them to risk entering the water. Finally, the cubs wandered further up the beach toward the forest edge. The sow glanced between her offspring and the two shivering women on the rocks, then made her decision. She turned and lumbered after the cubs, disappearing into the thick brush. Jenna and Shiloh waited another 10 minutes, hardly daring to believe their ordeal might be ending. A fishing boat appeared around the point, heading toward the deeper channel. Both women immediately began waving and shouting, their voices hoarse from cold and fear. The captain, a local fisherman who knew these waters well, spotted them and altered course. He radioed the Coast Guard while maneuvering closer, explaining that he had 2 kayakers stranded on the rocks with an incoming tide. The rescue took only minutes once the boat arrived. The fishermen pulled them aboard, wrapped them in emergency blankets, and headed at full speed toward Kodiak City. Jenna had sustained gashes on her arms from the bear's initial attack on her kayak, and both women were treated for mild hypothermia at the local medical center. Their experience prompted renewed warnings from wildlife officials about maintaining a safe distance from brown bears, particularly during the summer months when cubs are present, and bears are more likely to frequent coastal areas to feed. On September 23, 2021, a small supermarket in the remote forests of Ussuri Krai, Russia, served as the primary supply point for several scattered villages and logging camps in the region. The area, located in the far eastern reaches of Siberia near the border with China, was characterized by dense taiga forest and limited infrastructure. The nearest substantial town lay over 100 kilometers away, accessible only on rough dirt roads that became impassable during heavy rains. The region was home to the Ussuri brown bear, a massive subspecies closely related to the North American grizzly, with males sometimes exceeding 600 kilograms. The supermarket itself was a modest single-story concrete structure, painted a fading blue, with a corrugated metal roof and small windows reinforced with bars. It stocked basic supplies, including canned goods, dried pasta, flour, sugar, and batteries, as well as whatever fresh food could be transported from larger settlements. A refrigerated section stored meat and fish when the generator was functioning properly. Residents depended entirely on this store, as growing seasons were short and hunting regulations had become stricter in recent years. That particular afternoon arrived with heavy fog rolling through the forest, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters. Smoke from wildfires burning several hundred kilometers to the west had been drifting into the region for weeks, creating an acrid haze that lingered between the trees. Wildlife officials had issued warnings that the fires were pushing animals out of their normal territories, but most villagers paid little attention to such announcements. Bears were common enough in the area that residents had long since grown accustomed to their presence. Around 4 p.m., a delivery truck arrived, carrying bread, canned fish, and fresh vegetables. Word spread quickly through the small community, and within 20 minutes, approximately 15 people had gathered outside the supermarket, waiting for the goods to be unloaded and priced. Among them stood Viktor Smirnov, a 47-year-old mechanic who maintained equipment for the local logging operation. He carried 2 canvas shopping bags and chatted with neighbors about the upcoming winter preparations. Also present were several elderly women, 2 loggers still wearing their work clothes, a young mother with a toddler balanced on her hip, and the truck driver who was assisting the store owner in moving crates from the vehicle. The group stood clustered near the entrance, some smoking cigarettes, others discussing the quality of the vegetables. Nobody paid attention to the tree line roughly 30 meters behind the building. The bear emerged from the fog without warning, a massive male that had been traveling for days in search of food. The wildfires had destroyed much of the berry crop in his normal territory, and salmon runs in the rivers had been poor that year. Hunger had driven him closer to human settlements, following the scent of food that emanated from the supermarket's refuse area. He was enormous, even by Ussuri standards, his shoulder height exceeding 1 meter when he walked on all fours. Someone shouted, though later nobody could remember who had first seen the animal. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Several people rushed toward the supermarket entrance, colliding with one another in their panic. The young mother screamed and clutched her child tighter. The bear, startled by the sudden movement and noise, broke into a charge. The animal covered the distance to the building in seconds, its speed shocking for something so large. It crashed through the entrance, splintering the wooden door frame. The interior of the supermarket was cramped, with narrow aisles barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Those who had made it inside found themselves trapped with limited options for escape. Victor had pushed 2 children behind a display of canned goods, positioning himself between them and the rampaging bear. The animal reared up on its hind legs, its head nearly touching the ceiling, and struck Victor with one massive paw. The impact killed him almost instantly, the force crushing bone and causing catastrophic internal injuries. He collapsed without making a sound. The bear then turned its attention to overturned crates and scattered food items, grabbing packages in its jaws. Several people had managed to flee through a back storage area, while others remained frozen behind shelves. The store owner, who kept a hunting rifle in his office, fired a shot into the ceiling, hoping the noise would drive the animal out. Instead, the bear wheeled around, knocking over an entire shelving unit that crashed down with a tremendous clatter. Outside, one of the loggers had run to his truck and retrieved a flare gun. He fired it toward the supermarket entrance, the bright red flare streaking through the fog. The combination of the rifle shot, the flare, and the general chaos finally motivated the bear to retreat. It lumbered back out through the destroyed entrance and disappeared into the forest, moving away from the smoke and commotion. Local authorities arrived within 15 minutes, summoned by frantic phone calls from villagers. They found Viktor Smirnov's body inside the wrecked supermarket, surrounded by scattered groceries and broken glass. The 2 children he had protected were physically unharmed but deeply traumatized. Several other people had sustained minor injuries from being knocked down or cut by debris during the panic. A tracking team with dogs attempted to locate the bear but lost its trail in the dense forest after several hours. The fog and smoke made tracking nearly impossible. Wildlife officials posted warnings throughout the region and temporarily closed several forest access roads. The incident prompted an emergency review of safety measures for remote Siberian communities, with recommendations including reinforced building entrances, bear-proof refuse storage, and the mandatory use of air horns for businesses in wilderness areas. Viktor Smirnov's family held his funeral 4 days later, attended by most of the village. His actions in protecting the children were widely acknowledged, and local authorities later provided financial assistance to his widow and 2 teenage sons. The supermarket remained closed for 2 weeks while repairs were completed and security improvements installed, including steel-reinforced doors and an alarm system connected directly to the Regional Wildlife Management Office. On August 7, 2023, 3 university friends departed on a backpacking trip through a wilderness area in central Colorado's Sawatch Range. Troy Bennett, Zadie Ibarra, and Rex Monroe had planned the excursion for months, selecting a remote alpine lake as their destination. The region had experienced an exceptionally dry summer, with precipitation levels 40% below normal and temperatures consistently higher than average. These conditions had created a ripple effect throughout the ecosystem, reducing berry crops and forcing wildlife to expand their search for food into areas they might normally avoid. The wilderness area they chose covered over 120,000 acres of rugged mountain terrain, with elevations ranging from 2,500 to over 4,200 meters. Alpine lakes dotted the higher elevations, surrounded by sparse forest that gave way to tundra near the peaks. Black bears were common throughout the region, though they typically avoided human contact and were considered less dangerous than their grizzly cousins. However, wildlife officials had noted an increase in bear encounters that summer, particularly involving younger males that had learned to associate humans with easy food sources. The 3 friends arrived at their chosen campsite around 4 p.m., having hiked approximately 15 kilometers from the trailhead. The lake was pristine, its surface reflecting the surrounding peaks like polished glass. They established their camp on a flat area roughly 50 meters from the water's edge, setting up 2 tents and organizing their gear. Troy, who had the most backpacking experience, reminded the others about proper food storage protocols. They were supposed to hang their food bags from a high tree branch at least 100 meters from camp, suspended far enough from the trunk that bears could not reach them. The process of properly hanging food was tedious and time-consuming, requiring a strong cord and a suitable tree with appropriate branches. After several failed attempts to get the rope over a high enough branch, Troy grew frustrated. The sun was setting, they were tired from the hike, and the process seemed unnecessarily complicated, even though he rationalized it as a low-risk situation. He hung the food bag from a branch that was technically too low and too close to the trunk, but convinced himself it would suffice for one night. They ate dinner as darkness settled over the mountains, heating freeze-dried meals over a small camp stove. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared, as it typically did at that elevation. They discussed their plans for the following day, which included exploring the far side of the lake and possibly ascending a nearby peak, if the weather permitted. By 10 in the evening, all three had retreated to their tents, exhausted from the day's exertion. Around midnight, Zadie woke to the sound of something moving through their campsite. She initially assumed it was one of her friends making a bathroom trip, but the sounds were wrong. Heavy footfalls accompanied by snuffling and the rustle of equipment being knocked over. She unzipped her tent slightly and peered out into the darkness, her headlamp revealing a young male black bear standing upright, pawing at the improperly hung food bag. She shouted to wake the others, her voice cracking with alarm. Troy emerged from his tent immediately, adding his own yelling to hers. The standard response to a black bear involved making noise, appearing large, and backing away slowly. What happened next defied their expectations and training. Instead of fleeing, the bear dropped to all fours and charged directly at Troy. The behavior was unusual, but not unprecedented. This particular bear had been raiding campsites for several weeks, had lost its natural fear of humans, and had learned that aggression often resulted in people abandoning their food. Wildlife biologists would later classify the animal as food-conditioned and food-aggressive, a dangerous combination that typically resulted in the bear being euthanized. Troy barely had time to grab the bear spray canister from his tent pocket before the animal reached him. He deployed the spray from approximately 4 meters away, the orange cloud engulfing the bear's face. The bear hesitated but did not retreat. Rex had emerged from the other tent and was scrambling toward Troy when he slipped on a patch of loose shale, striking his head on a rock. He lay stunned, semi-conscious, and bleeding from a scalp laceration. Zadie grabbed Rex under his arms and dragged him behind a large boulder, her adrenaline providing strength she did not normally possess. Troy continued yelling and waving his headlamp, trying to keep the bear's attention away from the others. The animal circled him, occasionally lunging forward but pulling back before making full contact. This behavior continued for several terrifying minutes. The bear finally committed to a full attack, knocking Troy down and biting his left leg. Troy screamed and kicked at the animal's face with his free leg. Zadie found a metal cooking pot and began banging it loudly while maintaining her position, protecting Rex. The noise, combined with the lingering effects of the bear spray and Troy's resistance, finally motivated the animal to retreat. It grabbed the fallen food bag in its jaws and loped off into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. Troy's leg was bleeding heavily from multiple puncture wounds and lacerations. Zadie applied pressure using clothing from her pack, while Rex slowly regained his senses. They knew they needed professional medical help, but could not safely travel through bear habitat in the darkness with an injured person. Zadie activated their emergency beacon, a satellite device that transmitted their coordinates to rescue services. The beacon signal reached rescue coordinators around 1:30 in the morning. A helicopter crew was dispatched at first light, arriving at the lake shortly after 6. Medical personnel stabilized Troy's leg and evaluated Rex's head injury before airlifting both men to the nearest hospital. Zadie accompanied them, providing details about the encounter to wildlife officers who met them at the medical facility. Rangers returned to the campsite and found the torn food bag, tracks, and other evidence of the bear's presence. They set traps and monitored the area for several days before successfully capturing the animal. DNA from the food bag and Troy's wounds confirmed the bear's identity. As per protocol for food-aggressive bears with a history of human conflict, the animal was euthanized. The incident renewed debate about the enforcement of food storage regulations, with some officials advocating for substantial fines to ensure compliance and prevent the creation of dangerous wildlife situations. On August 28, 2019, in the remote village of Sapanta, located in Maramureș County in northwestern Romania, 42-year-old vineyard owner Luca Ionescu prepared for the late summer harvest. The town sat nestled in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, a region characterized by steep valleys, dense forests, and centuries-old traditions of agriculture and animal husbandry. The Carpathians harbor one of Europe's largest populations of brown bears, with estimates suggesting that over 6,000 individuals inhabit the Romanian mountains alone. These bears had coexisted with humans for generations, generally maintaining a cautious distance from settlements and cultivated land. The Ionescu family vineyard covered approximately 3 hectares on a south-facing hillside, producing grapes primarily for local wine production. The vines had been planted by Luca's grandfather decades earlier, and the family maintained them with careful attention to traditional methods. A modest farmhouse sat at the lower edge of the property, with a stone cellar built partially into the hillside for wine storage and aging. The property bordered protected forest land, with the tree line beginning less than 100 meters from the uppermost rows of vines. The summer of 2019 had been problematic for wildlife throughout the Carpathians. A late spring frost had damaged wild berry crops, and the subsequent summer drought had further reduced the availability of natural food sources that bears depended upon to build fat reserves before winter hibernation. Desperate bears had been reported raiding beehives, breaking into livestock pens, and venturing closer to human settlements than usual. Local authorities had issued advisories about securing food sources and avoiding unnecessary encounters, but most residents viewed bears as a manageable fact of rural life rather than an immediate threat. That evening, Luca decided to inspect the ripening grapes in the upper rows of the vineyard. The harvest was scheduled to begin in approximately 1 week, and he wanted to assess whether any sections might benefit from being picked earlier. His 16-year-old daughter, Elena, stood on the farmhouse balcony watching him work, as she often did while completing her homework or reading. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the hillside and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Luca moved between the vine rows with practiced efficiency, occasionally plucking a grape to taste and assess its sugar content. He carried 2 plastic crates for collecting sample clusters, planning to bring them to the cellar for closer examination. The evening was quiet, except for the sounds of insects and the occasional call of birds as they settled for the night. From the forest edge, a large male brown bear emerged into the vineyard. The animal was gaunt despite its considerable size, with ribs visible beneath its fur. It had traveled extensively, searching for food and moving through several territories in desperation. The scent of ripening grapes had drawn it to the cultivated hillside, though bears typically preferred protein and fat sources over fruit. Elena saw the bear first, her initial reaction being confusion rather than alarm. In the fading light, and at a distance of roughly 70 meters, the animal's silhouette resembled that of a large dog, or perhaps a wild boar. She called out to her father, asking if he could see the strange animal near the vines. Luca straightened up from his work and turned toward where Elena was pointing. When he recognized the bear, his first response was to step forward rather than retreat. This proved to be a fatal mistake. Local folklore and outdated advice sometimes suggested that brown bears could be intimidated by confident human behavior. Still, this particular animal was too hungry and desperate to be deterred by such displays. The bear immediately charged. Luca stumbled backward, his foot catching in the wire support system used to trellis the vines. He fell heavily into the grape plants, which collapsed under his weight. The bear reached him within seconds, striking him with a powerful blow that broke multiple ribs. Elena began screaming from the balcony, her voice echoing across the valley. She ran inside the house and grabbed a flare gun that her father kept for emergency signaling. Racing back to the balcony, she fired the flare directly over the vineyard. The bright red projectile streaked across the darkening sky, but the bear barely registered its presence. Elena loaded another flare and fired again, this time aiming closer to the animal. The light and sound caused the bear to pause briefly, lifting its head to sniff the air. The interruption was temporary. The bear returned its attention to Luca, who was attempting to crawl toward the lower vineyard rows. Elena ran down the exterior stairs and into the vineyard herself, waving a flashlight and shouting continuously. Her courage was remarkable for someone so young but ultimately ineffective. The bear, driven by hunger and perceiving threats to its immediate food source, continued its attack. Neighbors heard Elena's screams and the flares, and 3 men arrived within minutes carrying hunting rifles. The bear finally retreated into the forest at the sound of approaching voices and the sight of multiple lights converging on the vineyard. By the time the neighbors reached Luca, his injuries were catastrophic. Despite immediate first aid attempts and a call for emergency medical services, he died before an ambulance could reach the remote location. Elena sat beside her father's body, covered in his blood, refusing to leave him. The neighbors gently convinced her to move to the farmhouse while they waited for authorities to arrive. Police and wildlife officials reached the scene approximately 90 minutes later, documenting the attack and examining bear tracks in the soft soil between the vine rows. The bear was never captured, despite intensive tracking efforts over the following weeks. Wildlife officials theorized that it had likely traveled a considerable distance from the area immediately after the incident. The attack prompted county authorities to implement new safety protocols for rural areas, including recommendations for electric fencing around properties bordering forests, mandatory installation of motion-activated lights and alarms, and community education programs about appropriate responses to bear encounters. Elena Ionescu was left traumatized by witnessing her father's death and her inability to prevent it. Extended family members took over management of the vineyard, though Elena herself could not bring herself to return to the property for several years. The incident remains one of the most tragic bear encounters in Romanian history, highlighting the increasing conflicts between humans and wildlife as habitat pressures intensify and traditional food sources decline. On July 19, 2025, wildlife photographer Hannah Pierce drove along a narrow gravel road deep in the remote forests of northwestern Montana. The location was approximately 40 kilometers from the nearest town, accessible only by a series of deteriorating Forest Service roads that wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The region fell within the known range of grizzly bears, though encounters near roads were relatively uncommon. Most bears in the area had learned to associate roads with human presence and typically avoided them, particularly during daylight hours. Hannah had spent the previous 3 days photographing wildlife in the backcountry, staying at primitive campsites and hiking to locations known for elk, deer, and occasionally bears. Her work had been featured in several regional publications, and she was building a portfolio focused on large mammals in their natural habitats. This particular evening, she was driving back toward the main highway, planning to reach a motel before dark. The road followed a creek that meandered through the valley, and Hannah had stopped twice already to photograph the water's reflections in the golden hour light. As she rounded a bend at approximately 7:30 in the evening, she noticed a creek crossing where the water spread wide and shallow over smooth stones. The angle of the sun created perfect conditions for the type of landscape photography she specialized in. She pulled her truck to the side of the road and shut off the engine, gathering her camera equipment from the passenger seat. Through the windshield, she scanned the surrounding area, a habit developed through years of working in bear country. The forest appeared quiet and undisturbed. She noticed movement near the creek, approximately 60 meters away, and raised her binoculars. A massive grizzly bear was foraging along the creek bank, using its powerful claws to overturn rocks and expose insects and small organisms beneath. The animal appeared calm and focused entirely on feeding. Hannah estimated its weight to be well over 300 kilograms, based on its body structure and the prominent shoulder hump characteristic of grizzly bears. She knew that photographing bears required extreme caution and maintaining an appropriate distance, but the animal seemed unaware of her presence and was completely absorbed in its activity. She decided to take photographs from inside her vehicle, which would provide both safety and concealment. Wildlife photographers often used vehicles as mobile blinds, as many animals tolerated them better than exposed humans. Hannah started the engine again and repositioned the truck to get a better angle, moving slowly to avoid startling the bear. Once positioned, she shut off the engine and rolled down the driver's side window approximately 10 centimeters, just enough to fit her telephoto lens through the gap. The bear continued feeding, occasionally lifting its head to scan the area but showing no signs of alarm. Hannah began taking photographs, adjusting her settings to capture the warm evening light on the animal's silver-tipped fur. For several minutes, the situation remained peaceful. Hannah captured dozens of images, including several excellent shots of the bear standing upright to reach overhanging branches. Then the bear's behavior changed. It turned abruptly toward the truck, its posture shifting from relaxed to alert. Hannah immediately ceased photographing and remained motionless, hoping the bear would lose interest. Instead, the animal began walking directly toward the vehicle. Hannah's heart rate accelerated, but she reminded herself that grizzly bears often approached to investigate objects without necessarily being aggressive. She remained still and quiet, her hand hovering near the window controls. The bear reached the road and paused approximately 15 meters from the truck. It stood upright again, sniffing the air and swinging its head from side to side. Hannah could see its eyes clearly now, along with scars on its muzzle that suggested an older, experienced animal. The bear dropped back to all fours and continued approaching. When the bear reached the side of the truck, it rose again and placed both front paws against the driver's door. Hannah heard the metal groan under the animal's weight. She sat frozen, barely breathing. as the bear's face appeared directly outside her partially opened window. The smell was overwhelming. Damp fur, fish, and something musky that made her eyes water. The bear suddenly swiped at the side mirror with one massive paw, the impact creating a tremendous crashing sound. The mirror shattered, pieces of glass and plastic scattering across the road. Hannah reacted instinctively, pressing hard on the horn while simultaneously starting the engine. The loud noise caused the bear to drop back down, but it did not retreat. Instead, it circled to the rear of the vehicle. Hannah shifted into reverse, intending to back away from the animal, but the bear lunged at the rear wheel. She felt the entire truck rock as the animal slammed its weight against the side of the vehicle. Scratches appeared on the paint as the bear's claws gouged deep marks into the metal. Hannah abandoned her reverse plan and instead shifted to drive, accelerating forward while repeatedly honking the horn. The bear pursued for several meters, striking the rear of the truck one more time before stopping in the middle of the road. Hannah continued driving, checking her rearview mirror obsessively to ensure the animal was not following. Only after putting nearly a kilometer between herself and the encounter did she pull over, her hands shaking so badly she could barely maintain her grip on the steering wheel. She examined the damage in the fading light. The driver's side mirror was destroyed, with only the mounting bracket remaining. Deep scratches ran along the rear quarter panel and around the wheel well. One taillight had been cracked, but not shattered. The damage was extensive, but the vehicle remained fully functional. Hannah reported the incident to wildlife authorities the following day, providing detailed information about the location and time. Wildlife officers investigated and found tracks matching her description, along with the scattered remains of her side mirror. They theorized that the bear had been drawn to the vehicle by curiosity, or possibly by lingering food scents. However, Hannah insisted she maintained strict protocols about food storage in bear country. Officials classified the incident as a rare example of food-driven road aggression, though the exact motivation remained unclear. The bear's behavior of actively attacking a vehicle rather than simply investigating it was unusual enough to warrant alerts being sent to backcountry users in the region. Hannah's experience reinforced the unpredictability of grizzly bear behavior and the importance of maintaining awareness even in seemingly safe situations like photographing from inside a vehicle. The damaged truck served as a lasting reminder of how quickly peaceful wildlife observations could transform into dangerous encounters.